Hey guys, tonight we're taking a journey back in time, not to the gilded halls of kings and queens, but to the sun-baked, salt-crusted decks of pirate ships in the 17th and 18th centuries. Close your eyes and imagine the gentle rocking of a ship on a calm sea, the creak of the wooden hull, the quiet lapping of waves against the side. You're not a passenger. You're part of the crew, and the scent of tar, rope, and a distant shore fills the air. Tonight, we're peeling back the romanticized layers of pirate lore to uncover the very real, often overlooked lives of women who chose or were forced to live by the cutlass and the code. This is a world where a woman could be as feared as any man, a world full of danger and desperate freedom. You probably wouldn't last a day in this brutal, unpredictable environment, but for a little while, we can explore it from the safety of our beds. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We begin in the era often called the Golden Age of Piracy, a period roughly spanning from the 1650s to the 1730s. This was a time when European powers were expanding their colonial empires, and the seas, particularly the Caribbean, were a wild, lawless frontier. Think of it as the Wild West, but with more scurvy and slightly less banjo music. For most people, piracy brings to mind images of Blackbeard, Captain Kidd, and Captain Morgana, strictly male domain of burly men with eye patches and wooden legs, burying chests of gold on deserted islands. That's the myth, of course, a wonderfully dramatic and slightly goofy version of history that Hollywood loves to sell us. But the reality was far more complex and, frankly, much more boring in the day-to-day. Most pirates weren't living a life of constant adventure. They were just trying to survive. And within this male-dominated world, a small but significant number of women found their way onto the ships, defying every expectation of their time. The reasons they did this weren't always glamorous, which is a common thread you'll find woven through their stories. It wasn't about treasure maps and parrots for them. It was often a matter of escaping a much worse fate on land. Mainstream history books will tell you about the big, famous male pirates and their conquests. But they often gloss over the fact that a pirate ship was, in many ways, an escape hatch from the rigid social structures of the time. The rules on land were strict and unforgiving, especially for women. If you were a woman, your life was pretty much dictated by your father, your husband, or your social class. Your future was about marriage and babies and managing a household. You didn't own property. You had very few legal rights, and your entire identity was wrapped up in the men around you. It was a suffocating existence for anyone with an independent spirit. So, when the opportunity arose to step outside of that, to literally sail away from it all, some women took it. They weren't joining a cruise ship for a vacation. They were joining a floating community of outcasts, people who had been rejected by or had rejected society. A fringe tidbit, often overlooked, is that these pirate communities sometimes had surprisingly progressive social contracts. For example, some pirate crews had a form of articles or codes that they all had to agree to. These codes, while still brutal in their punishments, sometimes included provisions for fair distribution of loot and even a form of early social security for those injured in battle. It wasn't a utopia, mind you, but it offered a level of equality that was completely absent on land. This is a point where historians still argue whether these pirate articles were truly a step toward a more egalitarian society, or if they were just practical rules for keeping a volatile group of men and women from killing each other. Regardless, they offered a different kind of life. For a woman, a life as a pirate meant shedding her previous identity. It meant dressing as a man, adopting a masculine persona, and learning to fight. It meant giving up the safety of a traditional life for the constant danger of the sea, the threat of storms, and the ever-present risk of capture and execution. This wasn't an easy choice, but for many, it was the only choice that offered any sense of control over their own destiny. Imagine a young woman today feeling trapped in her life, maybe in a job she hates or a situation that feels impossible to escape. She sees a chance to run away and start over, but it involves immense risk and requires her to completely reinvent herself. That's a little like what these female pirates did. They just didn't have a car or a new city to run to. They had a leaky wooden ship and an ocean full of uncertainty. But on that ship, they could be someone else. They could be a man named Mark or Jack, and for a while, no one would know the difference. It was a way to disappear into a world that wasn't designed for them, and in doing so, they created a new space for themselves. So, you've decided to cast off the constraints of polite society. What does that actually look like for a woman in the 17th century? You're probably not sailing away with a charismatic rogue on a grand, romantic adventure, though that's the version that ends up in the novels. More likely, your life on land was so unbearable that any alternative, no matter how dangerous, seemed preferable. Maybe you were an orphan, or an indentured servant whose contract was little more than a form of slavery. Perhaps you were fleeing an abusive family or a forced marriage. Life was cheap, and for a woman without property or a family name, it was cheaper still. Historians still argue about the exact number of female pirates, partly because so many of them went to great lengths to hide their identities. But we know it wasn't an anomaly. It was a rare choice, yes, but a choice nonetheless, born of desperation and a fierce desire for self-preservation. Let's try to put ourselves in her shoes for a moment. You're on the docks, perhaps in a bustling port like Port Royal in Jamaica, or Nassau in the Bahamas. The air is thick with the smell of rum, fish, and unwashed bodies. You're watching the ships come and go, massive wooden behemoths that look like floating towns, and you see an opportunity. You know you can't just walk onto a ship and say, "I'd like to be a pirate, please." The crew would laugh you overboard, if not worse. So, you have to reinvent yourself. You chop off your hair, bind your chest, and start wearing the coarse, baggy clothes of a sailor. It's not just a disguise, it's a total transformation. You have to learn to walk and talk like a man, to carry yourself with a certain gruff bravado that tells the world you're not to be messed with. This wasn't an easy acting job. It was a matter of life and death. One wrong look, one feminine gesture, and your secret could be out with dire consequences. Mainstream history tends to focus on the flashy battles and buried treasure, but the real story, the fringe tidbit that tells us so much, is about this constant low-level anxiety. Imagine living every day in fear of being discovered, every interaction a performance. The reasons for a woman to turn to piracy are a major point of scholarly debate. Was it for the money, the freedom, or was it simply an act of rebellion against the patriarchy? The answer is probably a mix of all three. but the initial motivation was almost always survival. Take, for instance, a young woman from a wealthy family who finds herself disowned. On land, her prospects are grim. She's an outcast, and without the protection of her family name, she's vulnerable. But at sea, under a new identity, she could start over. She could learn to fight, to navigate, to become a contributing member of a crew. She wouldn't be a delicate lady anymore. She would be a seaman, a pirate, and her worth would be measured by her skill, not her gender. The pirate's code, which we'll get into more later, was surprisingly meritocratic in some ways. It didn't matter who you were on land. On the ship, you were judged by your ability to pull your weight. A quirky, often ignored fact is that some female pirates were known for being particularly ruthless. Perhaps they felt they had to be to prove they belonged. They couldn't afford to show weakness. This leads us to the quiet, subtle dangers of ship life that had nothing to do with cannonballs. Scurvy was a constant threat, and so were infections from even the smallest cuts. The food was often terrible, a mix of hardtack and salted meat that would make you miserable. But for a woman in disguise, the greatest threat wasn't a disease or a storm. It was the claustrophobic closeness of life on a ship. You couldn't have a moment to yourself. You were sleeping in a hammock next to dozens of men, eating with them, working with them, all day, every day. Think about what a logistical nightmare that must have been. How did you maintain your disguise? How did you deal with personal hygiene? These are the unglamorous details that the adventure movies never show you. You're just always on edge, always in character. And remember that the threat wasn't just physical, it was psychological. You had to suppress your true self, your past, everything that made you you, and replace it with a new, tougher persona. It was a heavy price to pay for a shot at freedom, but for some, it was the only shot they had. It's this quiet, internal struggle that makes their stories so compelling, far more than the superficial tales of buried treasure. The real treasure was simply the chance to live. Mary Read's story is one of the most famous examples of this kind of desperate reinvention. And it starts not on the high seas, but in the quiet domesticity of 17th century England. You can imagine the scene: a small, unremarkable house, a woman named Mary trying to make ends meet after her husband's death. She has a daughter, also named Mary, but things are financially dire. To secure a modest inheritance from her late husband's family, she devises a plan that is as clever as it is audacious. She decides to pass her young daughter off as the son she had always claimed to have, a boy named Mark. This is the first crucial step in our protagonist's life of deception. Young Mary, our pirate-to-be, is dressed in boy's clothing and presented to her grandmother, who, we must assume, was not a particularly observant person. With this lie, a simple deception for financial gain, the stage is set for a life defined by a fake identity. Mainstream history tends to focus on the spectacular end of her career, but it's these quiet, mundane beginnings that are so fascinating. As the years went by, Mary continued to live as a boy. Her mother's ruse became her reality. As she grew into a young woman, she found work as a footboy, a male servant for a French lady. This was the first of many masculine roles she would play. From there, she worked on a man-of-war, an armed naval vessel, before deciding that her talents were better suited to a life on land. She next found employment as a soldier in Flanders, where she displayed such remarkable courage in battle that she earned the respect of her fellow soldiers. A fringe tidbit, often overlooked, is that during her time in the military, she fell in love with a fellow soldier. They kept their relationship a secret, and Mary revealed her true identity to him only after they had fallen deeply in love. They married, and with the prize money Mary had earned, they bought a tavern. This was a brief period of domestic tranquility, a short-lived escape from her life of deception. For a moment, she was simply Mary, a wife and a tavern owner. But fate, as it often does in these stories, had other plans. Her husband died, and Mary, now a widow, was once again faced with a life of poverty and limited options. Historians still argue whether Mary's decision to return to a male identity was a matter of convenience or a genuine feeling of empowerment. Was she more comfortable as a man, or was it simply the only way she knew how to survive? Whatever the reason, she sold the tavern and decided to travel to the West Indies, once again dressing as a man. Her ship was captured by English privateers, essentially legalized pirates, and she was forced to join them. This was her true entry into the world of piracy. From there, she joined a crew of pirates under the infamous Captain Jack Rackham, also known as Calico Jack. It's on his ship, the Revenge, that she would meet her most famous accomplice, Anne Bonny. You can just imagine the scene. A new crew member, a seemingly ordinary young man, joining a pirate ship. The men on the ship, rough and unkempt, probably paid him little mind, just another able body to help with the ropes and the cannons. They had no idea that Mark was a woman who had already lived a life of remarkable adventure and deception. This ability to live a double life, to completely shed one identity and assume another, is what makes Mary Read's story so compelling. It speaks to a level of resilience that we can only begin to imagine. It's a bit like our own lives today, in a way. We have our public selves and our private selves, but for Mary, the stakes were unimaginably high. One wrong word, one moment of carelessness, and her life was over. The physical disguise was only a part of it. She had to master the mannerisms, the way of speaking, the posture, everything. Think about how exhausting that must have been, never being able to let your guard down, but it worked. She wasn't just a passable man. She was a respected soldier and a competent sailor. Her reputation was built on her skill and her courage, not on her gender. It's a quiet testament to her strength of will, a quiet confidence that allowed her to thrive in a world that was designed to exclude her. And you can bet she didn't do it for fame or glory. She did it to survive, and in a way, to be free. Mary Read's transformation from a humble, impoverished girl to a seasoned sailor was a remarkable journey. But it was her military career that truly honed her skills and forged her reputation. Imagine her, a young woman in the late 17th century, disguised as a man, serving as a soldier in Flanders during the War of the Spanish Succession. It's a world of mud, cannons, and close-quarters combat. You're not just a cog in the machine. You're a soldier, and your life depends on your ability to hold your own. Mary proved to be an excellent soldier, displaying a ferocity and a quiet courage that earned her the respect of her comrades. This is a mainstream historical fact, even if it's one that often gets lost in the more sensational stories of her later life as a pirate. She wasn't just a woman in disguise. She was a competent and brave fighter. Her physical strength and mental fortitude were put to the test every day, and she passed with flying colors. It's a bit like someone today excelling in a career that was once considered exclusively for men. She had to be twice as good just to be considered equal. A fringe tidbit about this period in her life is how she navigated the emotional and social complexities of her disguise. Remember, she wasn't just performing a role, she was living it. She had to share barracks with other soldiers, live in incredibly close quarters, and maintain her composure at all times. And yet, she was still a person with feelings and desires. It's during this time that she falls in love with a fellow soldier, a man she could not have a relationship with as a fellow soldier. The fact that she was able to reveal her true identity to him and that he still loved her and married her speaks volumes about both of their characters. It was a brief moment of authenticity and happiness in a life filled with deception. Historians still argue whether her love for this man was what led her to temporarily abandon her masculine identity, or if she simply saw an opportunity for a stable, domestic life. Whatever the reason, it was a profound choice, a decision to trade the freedom of a soldier for the quiet comforts of a tavern keeper. You can imagine her, tired of the constant vigilance, the fear of exposure, and simply wanting a normal life. This brief foray into normalcy was a testament to her humanity, a reminder that underneath the male persona and the hardened exterior, she was a person who longed for connection and love. But as we know, that peace was not to last. After her husband's death, Mary was plunged back into a world of uncertainty. With no husband to provide for her and no military career to fall back on, she was forced to return to her life of disguise. She boarded a ship to the West Indies, hoping to find a new life, but her journey was cut short by a fateful encounter with pirates. Her ship was captured, and Mary, still disguised as a man, was given a choice: join the pirate crew or face the consequences. She chose to join them. This is where her story truly becomes intertwined with the larger narrative of piracy. It's a classic example of someone being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But for Mary, it was also an opportunity. It was a chance to use the skills she had already acquired: her courage, her ability to fight, and her mastery of deception in a new and unpredictable environment. It was an involuntary career change, but one she was uniquely suited for. This leads us to the pivotal moment where Mary's story converges with that of another famous female pirate, Anne Bonny. Mary, now a crew member on Calico Jack Rackham's ship, the Revenge, was living her life as a man. She was a quiet and unassuming sailor, just another member of the crew. But she was about to meet a woman who was living a similar double life, a woman who had a fiery and rebellious spirit. You can imagine the tension and the surprise when she discovered Anne Bonny's true identity. The ship was a melting pot of hardened criminals and desperate men, and yet there were these two women, living side by side, sharing a secret that could get them both killed. Their shared secret would form a bond between them, a powerful and unique connection in a world that was otherwise filled with distrust and violence. It's a fascinating moment in history, a moment where two women from vastly different backgrounds came together on the high seas, united by their defiance and their shared fate. We'll explore Anne Bonny's own story next, but for now, let's just sit with the image of these two women working side by side on a pirate ship, each of them a secret waiting to be discovered. The meeting of Mary Read and Anne Bonny aboard the Revenge is a pivotal moment, but to truly understand their connection, we first need to explore Anne Bonny's backstory. Unlike Mary, who came from a background of poverty and necessity, Anne was born into a life of relative privilege. Her story begins in County Cork, Ireland, around 1700, though historians still argue about the exact date and location. She was the illegitimate daughter of a prominent lawyer, William Cormac, and his maid, Mary Brennan. Mainstream history tells us that her father, fearing a scandal, moved with his mistress and young daughter to London, pretending Anne was a boy to avoid social ruin. This early life of deception, much like Mary Read's, set a precedent for Anne's future. When his wife found out about the affair and his new family, William Cormac disowned her, but not Anne or her mother. He instead moved them to the American colonies, where he bought a large plantation in Charleston, South Carolina. Anne grew up on this plantation, living a life of wealth and comfort, but she was never truly accepted by colonial society due to her illegitimacy. Even as a young girl, Anne displayed a fiery and rebellious spirit that defied the expectations of her time. A fringe tidbit about her youth is a legend that she once stabbed a servant girl with a table knife in a fit of rage, though this story is likely exaggerated or apocryphal. What is certain is that she was known for her quick temper and her refusal to conform. She was headstrong and independent, a dangerous combination for a woman in the 18th century. Her father, hoping to settle her down, arranged a marriage for her with a wealthy planter, but Anne had other ideas. She was a woman who made her own choices, even if those choices were scandalous. She fell in love with a poor sailor and small-time pirate named James Bonny, a man her father despised. Against her father's wishes, she married him. This act of defiance was the final straw for her father, who promptly disowned her, cutting her out of his will and leaving her with nothing. With nowhere else to go, Anne and her new husband sailed to the pirate haven of New Providence in the Bahamas. This was the heart of the pirate world, a bustling port where pirates sold their loot, repaired their ships, and drank away their fortunes. It was a chaotic, lawless place, a perfect environment for a woman like Anne. But her marriage to James Bonny was not a happy one. He quickly became an informant for the colonial governor, Woodes Rogers, turning in his fellow pirates for a pardon and a bounty. Anne, disgusted by his cowardice and betrayal, despised him. She began to spend her time in the taverns, drinking and mingling with the pirates who came and went. It was here that she met Calico Jack Rackham, a charming and charismatic pirate captain. The two fell in love, and Anne left her husband to be with Rackham, a move that was highly scandalous and dangerous. Historians still argue whether Anne's motivation for leaving her husband was pure love for Rackham, or if it was a more practical decision to align herself with a more powerful figure in the pirate world. Regardless, she joined Rackham on his ship, the Revenge, and began her life as a pirate. She did not, at first, dress as a man. She fought openly as a woman, earning a reputation as a fierce and skilled fighter. You can imagine the shock and disbelief of the men she fought against. They were expecting to face a crew of rough-and-tumble sailors, not a woman with a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other. She became a fearsome figure on the ship, respected and feared by her crew. It was on this ship that she would meet Mary Read, a woman who had spent her entire life trying to be a man. The irony is palpable. Anne, a woman who had never tried to hide her identity, met a woman who was a master of disguise. Their shared passion for adventure and their defiance of gender norms would form a powerful friendship, a bond forged in the crucible of piracy and danger. Anne Bonny's life on the pirate ship Revenge was a dramatic turn from her privileged, if scandalous, upbringing. You can imagine her, a woman who had grown up on a wealthy plantation, now living on a cramped, smelly wooden vessel, surrounded by rough-and-tumble men. Her husband, James Bonny, had betrayed her, and her father had disowned her. She had nothing left to lose, which, for a pirate, is a powerful motivator. On the ship, she didn't hide her identity, at least not initially. She was known to the crew as Anne Bonny, the captain's woman, and a fearsome fighter in her own right. She wasn't a damsel in distress. She was a partner in crime, and she was damn good at it. Mainstream history tends to focus on the male captains, but a crucial part of the story is how a woman like Anne could not only survive, but thrive in such a harsh environment. Her reputation wasn't just about her relationship with Calico Jack. It was about her skill with a pistol and a cutlass. She was known to be as vicious in a fight as any man, and she earned the respect of the crew through her bravery and her ruthlessness. A fringe tidbit about her time on the ship is the theory that she became pregnant while at sea, a logistical nightmare for a pirate. There is some evidence that she was put ashore in Cuba to have her baby, and then she rejoined the crew. This is a point where historians still argue whether this was a common occurrence or an anomaly. What's certain is that it shows the complex and often unseen side of pirate life. It wasn't all sailing and fighting. There were moments of domesticity, of life and death, that played out in the shadows. Imagine the challenges of childbirth on a pirate ship, or even on a remote island. It was a perilous situation, and it shows that even in the lawless world of piracy, there were still moments of human vulnerability and care. Anne's willingness to return to the sea after giving birth is a testament to her adventurous spirit and her loyalty to Calico Jack and the pirate life. She could have stayed on land, perhaps found a way to live a quiet life with her child, but she chose to return to the danger of the seas. The moment she meets Mary Read is one of the most intriguing moments in pirate history. Anne, a woman who had never pretended to be anything she wasn't, meets Mary, a woman who had spent her entire life in disguise. The story goes that Anne was initially attracted to Mary, mistaking her for a handsome young sailor. When she learned that Mark was in fact a woman, the two became close friends. Their shared secret created an unbreakable bond, a quiet alliance on a ship full of men. They were a force to be reckoned with, fighting side by side in battles, and they were often described as being the most fearsome members of the crew. It's a bit like two secret agents from opposing sides discovering they're both working for the same cause. They were both outsiders in a world of outsiders, and they found a kind of kinship in their shared experience. This friendship and partnership is a powerful example of how the pirate world, for all its brutality, could sometimes be a space of unexpected connections. The Pirate Code, which we'll discuss in more detail later, was a strange mix of democracy and authoritarianism, but it did offer a level of equality that was absent on land. For Mary and Anne, this meant they were judged by their actions, not their gender. They were respected for their skill and their courage, and they were given the same share of the loot as the men. You can imagine the quiet moments they must have shared, talking about their lives, their pasts, and their dreams for the future. They were two women who had defied all expectations, and in each other they found a kindred spirit. Their story is a powerful reminder that history isn't just about the big events and the famous men. It's also about the quiet, personal stories that unfolded in the background. Stories of love, friendship, and survival against all odds. Now, we need to talk about the Pirates Code. It's a term that gets thrown around a lot in movies and books, usually with dramatic flair. But what was it, really? It wasn't a single, universally accepted constitution that all pirates followed. Instead, each pirate crew often had its own set of rules, known as the Articles of Agreement, that every crew member had to sign. Think of it as a social contract for a group of outcasts. These articles were surprisingly democratic in many ways. They laid out how the loot would be divided, how punishments would be meted out, and what the responsibilities of each crew member were. Mainstream history often highlights the brutal aspects, like the punishment for stealing from a crewmate. But a fringe tidbit is that these codes also included a kind of early workers' compensation. If you lost a limb in battle, for example, the code would stipulate that you received a certain amount of silver or gold to compensate you for your injury. It was a pragmatic system designed to keep a volatile crew from descending into chaos. These articles were a crucial part of life aboard a pirate ship, and they offered a level of equality that was absent in the Royal Navies of the time. While the captain was in charge, he was still bound by the articles, and he could be voted out by the crew if they felt he was not fit to lead. Historians still argue about the true extent of this democracy. Was it a genuine, shared power structure, or was it a fragile system that could be easily overthrown by a charismatic or ruthless leader? Regardless, it offered a different kind of life for the average sailor. For a woman like Mary Read or Anne Bonny, these articles meant that their worth was determined by their skill and their courage, not their gender. They were entitled to a full share of the loot, just like any man. They weren't paid less. They weren't given less important jobs. They were a part of the crew, and they were judged on their ability to fight, to navigate, and to follow the rules. It was a radical idea in a world where women were seen as property. Of course, the rules weren't always fair, and they were often enforced with brutal efficiency. The punishments for breaking the code could be severe, from being marooned on a deserted island to a swift death. But in a world without a legal system, these codes provided a framework for a functioning, if violent, society. One quirky example from an actual set of pirate articles was a rule that stated no crew member could play cards for money on the Sabbath. It's a strange mix of piety and piracy, a small detail that gives us a glimpse into the minds of the men and women who lived by these rules. They were not just mindless killers. They were people with their own beliefs, their own sense of order, however twisted it might seem to us today. For Mary and Anne, the pirate's code was a lifeline. It was a system that allowed them to be more than just women. It allowed them to be pirates, to be equals. They weren't seen as a novelty or as a distraction. They were a part of the crew, and they were expected to pull their weight, and they did. They were known for their ferocity in battle, often fighting more bravely than the men. This reputation was crucial for their survival, as it earned them the respect of the crew and the fear of their enemies. You can imagine a captured merchant sailor expecting to see a ship full of bearded men, and instead seeing a woman with a cutlass charging at them with a terrifying scream. It was a sight that would have been both shocking and terrifying, a moment that would have challenged everything they thought they knew about the world. It's a moment that we, from the safety of our beds, can only begin to imagine. A quiet bit of history that is far more thrilling than any fictional tale of swashbuckling heroes. So, what was daily life actually like for Mary Read and Anne Bonny aboard the Revenge? Forget the glorious, sanitized version you see in movies, with clean decks and neatly coiled ropes. The reality was much more mundane and, frankly, much smellier. The ship was a cramped, floating village of sorts, and privacy was a luxury that simply didn't exist. You can imagine the constant noise, the creaking of the ship's timbers, the snapping of the sails in the wind. the low rumble of men's voices, and the ever-present slosh of water in the bilges below your feet. For Mary and Anne, this claustrophobic environment was a constant test of their ability to maintain their cover in Mary's case, and their sanity in both cases. They would have taken part in all the daily chores of a sailor, scrubbing the decks, mending the sails, and standing watch. This was a mainstream historical fact. Everybody on a pirate ship had a job to do. There were no passengers. The hierarchy on a pirate ship, while more egalitarian than a Royal Navy vessel, still existed. There was the captain, the quartermaster, who was often in charge of discipline and dividing the spoils, and then the rest of the crew. Both Mary and Anne were considered valuable members of the crew due to their fighting prowess, and they would have had the same responsibilities as any other able-bodied seaman. But their lives would have been subtly different. A fringe tidbit that's often overlooked is the psychological toll of their situation. For Mary, every day was a performance. She had to constantly be on guard, remembering to use a masculine voice and masculine mannerisms. Imagine the exhaustion of never being able to be your true self. For Anne, who was more open about her identity, the challenge was different. She had to constantly prove herself to be tougher and more ruthless than the men around her, just to be taken seriously. She couldn't afford to show weakness, or she would be seen as a liability, not an asset. Historians still argue about the nature of their relationship. Were they just friends, or was there something more? We'll probably never know for sure, but we do know that their bond was strong enough to get them through some incredibly dangerous situations. They were a formidable duo in battle, and they were often described as the most fearsome members of the crew. They fought side by side, a testament to their trust in each other. Their presence on the ship must have been a strange anomaly. Here you have a crew of hardened criminals, men who had been rejected by society, and in their midst are two women, not as captives, but as equals. It's a quiet subversion of the gender roles of the time, a small pocket of a different kind of world existing on the high seas. A quirky detail often mentioned in accounts is their fierce tempers. When the male pirates would shy away from a fight, it was said that Mary and Anne would charge forward, cursing the men for their cowardice. Their lives weren't just about fighting, though they would have also experienced the long periods of boredom that are a part of life at sea. They would have told stories, sung sea shanties, and gambled with dice. The food would have been terrible, a constant diet of hardtack, salted meat, and whatever fish they could catch. There would have been moments of calm and moments of terror. A fierce storm would have been a terrifying experience, and you can imagine the two of them lashed to the mast, fighting to keep the ship afloat. Their world was one of constant uncertainty, where a calm day could turn into a deadly storm in a matter of minutes, and a peaceful voyage could be interrupted by a surprise attack from a naval vessel. It's a reality that is far more compelling than the Hollywood myth, a world where survival was a daily struggle and every day was a victory. A key part of their survival and success was their attire, a subject that's often misunderstood in the popular imagination. When you think of a pirate, you probably picture a guy with a bandana, a loose shirt, and maybe a leather vest. The reality for Mary Read and Anne Bonny was much more pragmatic. They weren't dressing for a costume party. They were dressing for combat and for life at sea. For Mary, her attire was a crucial part of her disguise. She would have worn the same simple, baggy clothing as the male sailors, a coarse linen shirt, wide-legged trousers, and maybe a canvas jacket to protect against the spray. This mainstream historical fact is a simple one. but it's essential for understanding her life of deception. The baggy clothes hid her figure, and the simple cuts were practical for climbing ropes and mending sails. There was no room for fashion on a pirate ship, only functionality. For Anne, the situation was a little different. While she would wear masculine clothing for battle, there are accounts that she would sometimes wear more feminine attire when not in combat. Though this is a fringe tidbit and a point of some debate among historians. Regardless, in the heat of battle, both women would have been dressed for a fight. They would have worn a kind of proto-uniforma simple shirt, trousers, and a bandana to keep their hair out of their eyes. They would have been armed with a cutlass, a pistol, and maybe a dagger. The romanticized image of a pirate in a fancy velvet coat and a feathered hat is pure fiction. That kind of clothing would be a death sentence on a ship, as it would get caught in the rigging and make you an easy target. The pirates of the Golden Age were a pragmatic bunch, and their clothing reflected that. Historians still argue whether the women's choice of attire was a political statement or just a practical necessity. Was Anne's occasional choice of feminine clothing a way of asserting her identity as a woman in a man's world, or was it simply a matter of comfort? We'll probably never know for sure, but we can assume that their main priority was survival. A quirky detail from one of the historical accounts of their trial mentions that they were dressed in men's jackets and long trousers. This simple observation gives us a vivid glimpse into what they would have looked like in court, a visual that is far more powerful than any artistic rendering. It shows us that their attire was not just a disguise. It was a uniform, a symbol of their new identity as pirates. Their appearance on the ship must have been a constant source of fascination and fear. You can imagine the crew of a merchant ship seeing a pirate ship approaching, and then, in the midst of the chaos and the smoke, seeing two women fighting with a ferocity that was almost supernatural. It would have been a moment of pure terror, a sight that would have stayed with them for the rest of their lives. For Mary and Anne, their attire was a kind of armor. It protected them not just from the elements, but from the expectations of the world. It allowed them to be more than just women. It allowed them to be pirates, and in doing so, they created a new space for themselves in a world that had no place for them. Their attire was a symbol of their defiance, a quiet rebellion against the norms of their time. It's a powerful reminder that sometimes the simplest things can be the most revolutionary. And so, as you drift off, imagine the soft rustle of their rough-spun clothes as they stood on the deck, a silent testament to their courage and their will to survive. The moment of a boarding party was the most dangerous and chaotic part of a pirate's life, and it's where the myth of the swashbuckling hero clashes most violently with the brutal reality. When you think of a pirate battle, you probably picture a scene from a movie, with two ships gracefully maneuvering and pirates swinging from ropes with a cutlass in their teeth. The truth, as a mainstream historical fact, was far messier. A pirate attack was often a quick, violent affair, designed to terrify the crew of the merchant vessel into surrender with minimal resistance. The pirate's goal was not to sink the ship, but to capture it and its cargo intact. So, the attack would often begin with a volley of cannon fire, not to sink the ship, but to disable it and demoralize the crew. Then came the boarding party. For Mary Read and Anne Bonny, this was their moment to shine. They were known for their ferocity and their willingness to charge into the fray. You can imagine the scene. The two ships colliding with a sickening thud, the splintering of wood, the sound of gunfire, and the screams of men. The pirates would pour onto the deck, a wild and terrifying mob, and in the midst of them would be Mary and Anne. A fringe tidbit, often recounted in the historical record, is that they were so ferocious in battle that they would often fight with the fury of two she-devils. They were not just participating in the battle, they were often leading the charge, cursing the men who hesitated to follow them. They were fearless, and their courage was a crucial part of the crew's success. Historians still argue whether their ferocity was a natural part of their personalities or a calculated performance. Were they genuinely bloodthirsty, or were they simply trying to prove themselves to the men around them? We'll never know for sure, but we can assume it was a mix of both. They knew that their survival depended on their ability to be seen as equals, and in the brutal world of piracy, that meant being just as, if not more, violent than the men. Their reputation for ferocity was a form of protection. No one would dare mess with the women who fought like devils. This is a quiet but powerful part of their story, a testament to their strength and their will to survive. It's a bit like a modern-day woman in a male-dominated field who feels she has to work twice as hard and be twice as tough to be taken seriously. The stakes were just a little higher for Mary and Anne. The brutal reality of the boarding party is a far cry from the swashbuckling myth. It was a world of close-quarters combat, of the smell of gunpowder and blood, of the sheer terror of fighting for your life. And in the midst of this chaos, two women found a way to not only survive, but to thrive. They were not just pirates, they were warriors, and their story is a quiet reminder that courage knows no gender. A quirky detail that adds to their legend is that they would sometimes fight bare-breasted, with a pistol in one hand and a cutlass in the other, to terrify their enemies. While this is likely an exaggeration, it speaks to their reputation and the fear they inspired. It's a legend that's been passed down through the ages, a testament to the fact that they were not just pirates. They were a force of nature. And as we drift off to sleep, we can think of these two women fighting for their lives and winning their freedom one battle at a time. The Golden Age of Piracy, like all golden ages, had to come to an end. And for Mary Read and Anne Bonny, that end came in October 1720. Their ship, the Revenge, was anchored off the coast of Negril, Jamaica, and the crew, including Captain Calico Jack Rackham, was allegedly drunk and incapacitated after a night of heavy drinking. Mainstream history tells us that a heavily armed sloop, commissioned by the governor of Jamaica, Woodes Rogers, and commanded by Captain Jonathan Barnett, snuck up on them. Barnett's crew boarded the Revenge and captured the pirates with little to no resistance, all except for two. The only ones to put up a fight were Mary Read and Anne Bonny. In a final, desperate act of defiance, they fought off Barnett's crew for as long as they could, reportedly shouting curses at their male crewmates for their cowardice. This is a crucial, defining moment in their story, a final testament to their courage and their ferocity. A fringe tidbit from the historical record, often cited, is that during the trial, Calico Jack reportedly said that if there had been more women like them on the ship, they would have never been captured. While this might have been a bit of hyperbole, it speaks to the immense respect they had earned from their captain and their crew. Their capture was not a glorious battle, but a sad and ignominious end to their careers. They were taken to Spanish Town, Jamaica, where they were put on trial for piracy. The trial was a highly sensationalized event, and the fact that two of the pirates were women only added to the public's fascination. You can imagine the scene, a courtroom packed with people, eager to get a glimpse of the notorious she-devils of the Caribbean. The trials were swift and brutal, and all of the pirates, including Calico Jack, were sentenced to be hanged. Historians still argue about the details of the trial and the specific charges against them. We have some records, but many of the details have been lost to time. What we do know is that Mary and Anne were given the same sentence as the men, but their story, of course, does not end there. Their final act of defiance was yet to come. It was after the sentencing that they revealed a secret that would save their lives, at least for a while. This is a quiet but crucial part of their story. They weren't just pirates, they were also women, and in the 18th century legal system, that distinction would prove to be a lifeline. The trial itself was a mockery of justice in many ways, but it did follow the legal customs of the time. The prosecution presented its case, and the defense, such as it was, did its best. Calico Jack and the other men were all found guilty and were sentenced to be hanged. But when it came to Mary and Anne, something different happened. They were sentenced to death, but they had a legal recourse that was only available to women. They were about to plead the belly, a legal phrase that would buy them some time, and in Mary's case, an eventual escape from the noose. A quirky detail from the trial transcript is Anne's famous last words to Calico Jack, who asked her to visit him before his execution. She reportedly replied, "I am sorry to see you here, but if you had fought like a man, you would not have been hanged like a dog." It's a brutal and unforgettable line, a final, stinging indictment of his cowardice and a testament to her own indomitable spirit. When faced with the gallows, Mary Read and Anne Bonny had one last recourse to delay their execution, a legal plea known as pleading the belly. This was a mainstream historical fact, a legal loophole that allowed a woman to stay her execution if she was pregnant. You can imagine the scene in the courtroom after being sentenced to death. The two women were asked if they had anything to say as to why the sentence of death should not be carried out. Both women, in a moment of quiet defiance, responded that they were quick with child. This meant that they were pregnant and could feel the child moving. A jury of women was then convened to examine them, and they were found to be telling the truth. Their executions were stayed. This was a common practice in the 18th century, a strange mix of misogyny and mercy. Women were seen as fragile vessels, and the idea of killing an unborn child was considered an even greater sin than piracy. This legal maneuvering bought them time, but it wasn't a pardon. It was a temporary reprieve, a stay of execution until they had given birth. This is a point where historians still argue whether Mary and Anne were genuinely pregnant at the same time, or if one of them had a child earlier and the other simply used the same legal maneuver. Regardless, the fact that they were able to use the legal system to their advantage shows a certain level of cunning and intelligence. They weren't just brute force pirates. They were also strategic thinkers, capable of using the law to their benefit. A fringe tidbit that's often overlooked is the psychological toll of this waiting period. They were not free. They were simply living on borrowed time, knowing that the gallows were still waiting for them. It was a period of immense uncertainty, a quiet desperation that must have been almost as terrible as the thought of death itself. For Anne Bonny, this was her second child, having had one earlier in Cuba. For Mary Read, it was her first. The fact that they were facing the gallows while pregnant adds a layer of humanity to their story. They weren't just two-dimensional figures of chaos and violence. They were also women with a chance at motherhood, a quiet, domestic reality that was in stark contrast to their lives on the high seas. You can imagine the conversations they must have had, locked in their prison cells, waiting for a fate that was still unknown. They were no longer the fearsome pirates of the Caribbean. They were just two women facing a future that was completely out of their control. The details of what happened to them after the trial are murky, and this is where their stories diverge. Their shared fate was to be separated, one to a quiet, tragic end, and the other to a mysterious disappearance. The two women who had fought side by side, who had been partners in crime and in friendship, were now on two different paths. A quirky detail from the time is that Calico Jack, before his execution, was brought to a place where he could see the hanging of his men. It was a public spectacle, a warning to other would-be pirates. But for Mary and Anne, their executions were put on hold. They were given a chance at life, a small, fragile hope in a world that had tried to take everything from them. And so we're left with this image of two women separated by a prison wall, waiting for a fate that would be determined by the simple fact of their pregnancies. It's a powerful and poignant end to their shared journey, a quiet moment of humanity in a story of violence and chaos. The story of Mary Read takes a sad and quiet turn after the trial. Her reprieve was only temporary, a stay of execution until she could give birth. As a mainstream historical fact, we know that Mary Read died in a Jamaican prison shortly after her trial. The official parish burial register for St. Catherine, Jamaica, dated April 28, 1721, records the burial of Mary Read Pirate. A fringe tidbit is that the cause of her death is listed as a fever, though the exact nature of this illness is a matter of speculation. Historians still argue whether her death was a result of complications from childbirth, a disease she contracted in the unsanitary prison, or if she was simply too frail from her life at sea and the stress of her trial to survive. Whatever the reason, her life of adventure and deception ended not in a blaze of glory on the battlefield, but quietly in a dark and lonely prison cell. You can imagine the scene, the stark contrast between her vibrant, chaotic life and her final, peaceful moments. She was a woman who had lived as a man, a soldier, a sailor, and a pirate, and her final days were spent in a small, cramped cell, waiting for a fate that she knew was inevitable. Her death is a quiet tragedy, a reminder that even the most adventurous lives can end in a very unglamorous way. She had outlasted many of her male counterparts, including her captain, Calico Jack, who had already been hanged. But in the end, her life was cut short, a victim of the very system she had spent her life defying. A quirky detail that adds to the poignancy of her story is that her son, if he was born, is not mentioned in any of the records. We don't know what happened to him, or if he even survived. His fate is lost to time, a small, forgotten detail in a story full of bigger, more dramatic moments. Mary Read's story is a powerful reminder that history is not just about the winners, the people who lived to tell their tales. It's also about the quiet, forgotten lives of those who fell through the cracks. Her life was a series of deceptions, a constant performance, and yet she found moments of love, friendship, and a kind of freedom on the high seas. She was a woman who refused to be defined by the limitations of her time, and in doing so, she created a life that was entirely her own. Her death, while tragic, does not diminish her legacy. She was a pioneer, a woman who proved that gender was no barrier to courage, skill, and adventure. Her story ends with a quiet finality, but it's a story that has resonated throughout the ages. The image of this fearless woman fighting alongside men, defying every expectation, is a powerful one. She was a symbol of rebellion, a testament to the strength of the human spirit. And so, as we leave her in her prison cell, we can take a moment to reflect on her life and her quiet but profound impact on history. She was more than just a pirate. She was a survivor, a warrior, and a woman who dared to live a life that was impossible for her to have. And in that, there is a kind of enduring victory. While Mary Read's fate is a quiet, tragic certainty, the story of Anne Bonny takes a much more mysterious and, in some ways, romantic turn. After pleading her pregnancy, her execution was also stayed. But unlike Mary, there is no record of Anne Bonny's burial in the St. Catherine Parish Register. Her story simply disappears from the historical record. As a mainstream historical fact, Anne Bonny's last known location was a Jamaican prison cell in late 1720, and after that, we have nothing but speculation. This disappearance has led to a great deal of fascination and a number of theories about what might have happened to her. It's a point where historians still argue about her true fate, and it's a story that has captured the imagination of people for centuries. One theory, and a fringe tidbit often cited, is that her wealthy father, William Cormac, secretly paid a ransom to get her out of prison. He may have disowned her, but perhaps a part of him still loved his headstrong daughter. He may have used his connections and his wealth to secure her release, and she may have returned to the Carolinas, where she could live out the rest of her life under a new name. This theory suggests that she gave birth to her child in prison and then was released, disappearing into the vastness of the American colonies. It's a plausible theory, as her father was a man of means and influence, and the allure of a quiet domestic life may have been too strong for Anne to resist. After all, she had experienced the dangers of the sea, and perhaps with a child in her arms. She longed for a different kind of life, a life of peace and security. Another theory, much more dramatic and fitting for a woman like Anne, is that she escaped from prison and returned to the life of a pirate. There were many pirates still active in the Caribbean, and a woman of her skill and reputation would have had no trouble finding a new crew. This theory suggests that she continued her life of adventure, sailing the seas and living by the pirate's code. It's a more exciting end to her story, a final act of rebellion against the system that had tried to hang her. A quirky detail in some of the more romanticized accounts is that she changed her name to Anne Cormac, a nod to her father, and lived a long and happy life as a pirate captain. While this is likely a flight of fancy, it speaks to the enduring appeal of her story and the idea that a woman like her would not be easily tamed. The third and most mundane theory is that she simply died in prison, just like Mary Read. The records may have been lost, or she may have been buried in an unmarked grave. This is the least romantic theory, but it's also the most likely. Life in a prison in the 18th century was brutal, and disease was rampant. It's entirely possible that she, like so many others, succumbed to a fever or an infection. But for many, this quiet, unceremonious end is not fitting for a woman of her spirit. They prefer to imagine her sailing into the sunset, a final act of defiance against a world that tried to put her in a box. The fact that her fate is unknown allows us to project our own desires onto her story. We can choose to believe that she lived a long and happy life, or that she died a hero's death. The mystery is what makes her story so compelling. And so, we're left with a beautiful question mark at the end of her life. Anne Bonny, the fiery, rebellious pirate, simply vanished. Her disappearance is a powerful end to her tale, a final, quiet act of subversion. It's a reminder that not all stories have a neat and tidy conclusion. Sometimes, The most powerful stories are the ones that are left unfinished, the ones that allow us to fill in the blanks with our own imagination. As you get comfortable and start to drift off, you can imagine an either living a quiet life on a plantation or sailing the high seas on a new adventure. The choice, in a way, is yours. While the stories of Mary Read and Anne Bonny are the most well-known, they were by no means the only women to choose a life of piracy. Their stories simply happen to have the most detailed historical records. A mainstream historical fact is that throughout the Golden Age of Piracy, and even before, other women also defied societal norms to become pirates, privateers, or simply to survive on the high seas. Many of these women remain unnamed, lost to history, but a few, through sheer force of will or circumstance, managed to carve out a name for themselves. Their stories, though often less documented, are just as important in understanding the full picture of what it meant to be a female pirate. One such lesser-known figure is Rachel Wall, an American woman who operated in the late 18th century. Her story is particularly interesting because she wasn't a rebellious noblewoman or an orphan in disguise. She was a woman who was married to a man who had a terrible idea: to pretend to be a shipwrecked crew. She and her husband, George Wall, would sail along the New England coast, and when they spotted a ship, they would pretend to be a group of sailors whose ship had sunk. When the unsuspecting ship came to help them, they would board it and murder the crew, taking their valuables. This is a fringe tidbit, a kind of macabre detail that gives us a glimpse into the more desperate and brutal side of piracy. Rachel Wall wasn't a swashbuckling hero. She was a cold-blooded killer, and her story is a stark reminder that piracy wasn't always a romantic adventure. She was eventually captured, tried, and hanged, and her story is a powerful counterpoint to the more glamorous tales of Mary and Anne. Another figure, though her story is more a part of myth than history, is Jacquot Delahaye. This is a point where historians still argue about her existence. She was said to be a 17th century French pirate, known for her beautiful red hair and for her ferocity in battle. Legend says she faked her own death to escape her pursuers, living for several years as a woman with a mental disability to avoid detection. When she returned to piracy, she was so feared that she was given the nickname Back from the Dead, Red. While her story is likely a composite of several different pirates, it speaks to the enduring power of the idea of a female pirate. It's a quirky detail that shows us how much people wanted to believe in these figures, these women who defied every expectation and lived a life of total freedom. You can also think about the wives and partners of pirates who didn't necessarily sail on the ships, but were a crucial part of the pirate economy on land. They would have been the ones who helped sell the stolen goods, managed the money, and provided a safe haven for the pirates when they were on shore. This is a quiet, often overlooked part of the story. These women were not pirates in the traditional sense, but they were still a part of the pirate world, and their lives were just as dangerous and unpredictable. Their stories are a testament to the fact that the pirate world was not just about the ships and the battles. It was a complete ecosystem, and women were a crucial part of it. So as we leave Mary and Anne behind, we can remember that they were not alone. They were a part of a larger, though often hidden, history of women who defied the norms of their time. Their stories are a testament to the fact that even in the most male-dominated and violent of worlds, women could find a way to survive, and sometimes even to thrive. When we talk about female pirates, the name Qing Shi stands alone. She was a Chinese pirate who, as a mainstream historical fact, commanded the largest and most successful pirate fleet in history. Her story kicks off not on the open sea, but in a brothel in Guangzhou. There, a notorious pirate captain named Cheng. I saw her smarts and business skills and was so impressed that he decided to marry her. This is a point where historians still argue whether their relationship was based on love or mutual respect. But what is clear is that she was not just a pirate's wife. She was his partner, and she was just as involved in the business of piracy as he was. When Chang Ai died, Qing Shi, a woman who had once been a prostitute, was faced with a choice. She could have retired, lived a life of quiet luxury, but she chose to take control of her husband's fleet, the Red Flag Fleet. This is a fringe tidbit that often gets lost in the larger narrative of her success. She didn't just inherit the fleet, she had to fight for it. She outmaneuvered her rivals, including her husband's nephew, and consolidated her power. She proved to be a brilliant strategist and a fearsome leader, and under her command, the Red Flag Fleet grew to an astonishing size, with over 1,800 ships and a crew of over 80,000 pirates. It was an empire on the sea, and she was its empress. You can imagine the sheer scale of her operation. Her fleet was so large and so powerful that it was able to challenge the great naval powers of the time, including the Qing dynasty, the Portuguese Empire, and the British East India Company. She was an administrative genius, and a quirky detail is that she created a strict legal code that governed her pirate confederation. The code was brutally enforced, and it was designed to maintain order and discipline in her massive fleet. For example, any pirate who stole from the common plunder was to be executed. Any pirate who raped a female captive was to be beheaded. It was a harsh and unforgiving system, but it was also a system that worked. Her pirates were so disciplined and so effective that they were able to control the waters of the South China Sea, and they were the most feared force in the region. Qing Shi's story is a powerful reminder that women could not only survive in the world of piracy, they could also lead and command with a level of skill and authority that was unmatched by their male counterparts. Her story is a testament to her intelligence, her courage, and her business acumen. She was not just a pirate, she was a CEO, a military commander, and a leader of an entire society. She was a woman who rose from the lowest rung of society to become one of the most powerful people in the world. And she did it all on her own terms. Her story is a quiet triumph, a silent rebellion against a world that had tried to put her in a box. As you get comfortable, you can think of this woman, a former prostitute, commanding a fleet of thousands, a quiet reminder that true power is not always found in the traditional seats of authority. Qing Shi's rise to power was incredible, but it was her leadership of the Red Flag Fleet that solidified her place in history. You can imagine her, a woman who had once been a nobody, now commanding a fleet that was more powerful than many national navies. A mainstream historical fact is that she ruled with a level of discipline and organization that was unheard of in the world of piracy. Her fleet was not just a chaotic collection of ships, it was a highly organized military force with a clear chain of command and a set of rules that governed every aspect of life on board. She was a master of logistics, and she was able to keep her massive fleet supplied and ready for battle. A logistical feat that would be impressive even today. A fringe tidbit about her reign is that she was a shrewd businesswoman as well as a military commander. She didn't just raid ships, she also established a system of protection rackets. She would demand a fee from coastal villages and merchant ships in exchange for not attacking them. This gave her a steady stream of income, and it also allowed her to control the waters of the South China Sea. She was essentially a government in her own right, and her power was so absolute that the Qing dynasty, the official rulers of China, was powerless to stop her. This is a point where historians still argue whether her actions were a form of extortion or a legitimate form of governance. In a lawless world, her system of protection offered a kind of stability, however brutal it may have been. Her pirate confederation was a complex society with its own laws, its own economy, and its own culture. A quirky detail is that her legal code was particularly strict when it came to the treatment of female captives. Any pirate who took a female captive as a wife without her consent would be executed. This was a radical idea in a world where women were often treated as property. It shows that Qing Shi was not just a ruthless leader. She was also a woman who understood the plight of other women, and she was willing to use her power to protect them. She was a quiet revolutionary, a woman who, through her actions, challenged the patriarchal norms of her time. Her reign came to a peaceful end, which is perhaps the most surprising part of her story. After years of fighting against her, the Qing government finally offered her an amnesty. She accepted it, but not without some very strict conditions. She negotiated a deal that allowed her and her entire fleet to retire from piracy with their lives and their loot. She was even allowed to keep a small fleet of ships for her own use. She retired from piracy and lived a long, prosperous life, running a gambling house in Guangzhou until her death. You can imagine her, an old woman, sitting in her gambling house, surrounded by the echoes of her past life, a quiet legend in her own time. Her story is a testament to the fact that women could not only survive in the world of piracy, they could also become its most powerful and successful leaders. Jeanne de Clison's story is a violent and dramatic departure from the other female pirates we've discussed. She wasn't an orphan looking for a way out or a prostitute building an empire. She was a French noblewoman who, as a mainstream historical fact, became a pirate to seek revenge. Her story begins in the 14th century, in the midst of the 100 Years' War. Her husband, Olivier III de Clisson, a Breton lord, was suspected of treason by the French king, Philip V. He was invited to a tournament, arrested, and executed without a trial. His head was then displayed on a pike outside the gates of Nantes. This brutal and unjust act set Jeanne on a path of vengeance that would earn her the nickname the Lioness of Brittany. A fringe tidbit, and a point where historians still argue, is whether her husband was actually a traitor. Some records suggest he was, while others suggest he was a pawn in a larger political game. Regardless, Jeanne was convinced of his innocence and the injustice of his death. She sold all of her lands and possessions, bought 3 warships, and had them painted black with red sails. She named her fleet the Black Fleet, and she set out to wreak havoc on the French shipping lanes. You can imagine her, a noblewoman, a mother of 5, now a pirate captain, leading her crew into battle with a fury that was born of grief and a thirst for revenge. Her piracy was not about profit. It was a personal vendetta against the French king. Her targets were exclusively French ships, and her methods were particularly brutal. When she captured a French ship, she would kill the entire crew, leaving only a few sailors alive to carry a message back to the king. A quirky detail that adds to her fearsome reputation is that she would often behead the crew herself with an axe. She was a woman of absolute fury, and her actions were a brutal form of justice in a world that had denied her any legal recourse. She was a terror on the seas, and her name became synonymous with death and destruction. She was an absolute force of nature, a woman who had nothing left to lose, and who was willing to do anything to make the man who had killed her husband suffer. Her story is a powerful reminder that women could be just as brutal and violent as men, especially when driven by a powerful emotion like revenge. She was not a pirate by choice. She was a pirate by circumstance. Her life was a reaction to a terrible injustice, and her actions were a testament to her love for her husband and her hatred for the king who had killed him. She was a woman of immense power and influence, and she used that power to wage a one-woman war against a king. Her story is a quiet rebellion, a silent scream of rage against a world that had taken everything from her. As we leave her on the high seas, an axe in her hand, we can reflect on the quiet power of love and loss, and how they can drive a person to do unimaginable things. Grace O'Malley, known as Granuaile, the Pirate Queen of Ireland, is another fascinating example of a woman who defied the expectations of her time. As a mainstream historical fact, she was a chieftain of the O'Malley clan in the 16th century, a time of immense political turmoil in Ireland. Her story is a mix of history and folklore, and she is a national hero in Ireland, a symbol of resistance against English rule. Her life was not a simple choice to become a pirate. It was a matter of survival. The O'Malley clan was a seafaring clan, and their power was based on their control of the seas around the west coast of Ireland. Grace, from a young age, was a natural leader and a skilled sailor, and she took over the leadership of the clan after her father's death. A fringe tidbit about her youth is a legend that she once begged her father to let her go on a trading voyage with him. He refused, saying her long hair would get caught in the ropes. In a fit of defiance, she cut off her hair, a moment that earned her the nickname Mayhole, or Bald. This story, while possibly apocryphal, perfectly captures her fierce and independent spirit. She was a woman who was not going to be held back by her gender, and she was willing to do whatever it took to prove her worth. She was a master of diplomacy and a ruthless military commander, and she used her fleet to protect her clan's interests and to raid English and rival Irish ships. Historians still argue about the nature of her piracy. Was she a pirate in the traditional sense, or was she simply a warlord, a chieftain using her naval power to protect her territory and her people? The answer is probably a mix of both. She was a pragmatist, and she would ally herself with her enemies when it suited her, and she would fight against her allies when it didn't. Her most famous act of defiance was her meeting with Queen Elizabeth I in a moment of absolute power play. Grace sailed to London and met with the Queen, not as a subject, but as an equal. The two women, both powerful rulers in their own right, negotiated a deal that would allow Grace to continue her life on the seas. In exchange for her loyalty to the English crown, it was a remarkable moment in history, a meeting of two of the most powerful women of their time, and it's a testament to Grace's cunning and her diplomatic skills. A quirky detail about her meeting with Queen Elizabeth I is that she reportedly refused to bow to the Queen, claiming that she was a queen in her own right. She also supposedly carried a dagger in her dress, a quiet threat that showed she was not to be trifled with. She was a woman who lived by her own rules, and her story is a quiet rebellion against the idea that a woman's place was in the home. She was a leader, a warrior, and a mother, and she proved that a woman could be all of these things and still be a pirate queen. She was a symbol of Irish resistance, a hero to her people, and her story is a powerful reminder that history is full of remarkable women who refused to be forgotten. As we leave her on the misty shores of Ireland, we can think of her, a woman who controlled the seas, a queen of her own destiny. Beyond the dramatic battles and famous names, a crucial part of a pirate's life was the business side of things. And this is an area where women often played a quiet but vital role. As a mainstream historical fact, piracy was, at its core, a business. The goal wasn't just adventure, it was profit. Pirates needed to find a way to turn their stolen goods, be it gold, spices, or silk scent, to hard currency. This required a network of fences, merchants, and smugglers on land, and this is where many women came into their own. A fringe tidbit, often overlooked, is the role of these women as economic partners. While the men were at sea, fighting and plundering, the women on land were often the ones managing the finances, selling the loot, and providing a safe harbor for their pirate partners. They would have been running taverns, boarding houses, and other establishments that catered to the pirate community. They were the ones who had to navigate the complex and dangerous world of the black market, and they had to be just as cunning and ruthless as the pirates themselves. This is a point where historians still argue about the true extent of their involvement. Were they willing partners, or were they simply forced into this role by circumstance? The answer is probably a mix of both, but what is clear is that they were an essential part of the pirate economy. You can imagine a woman, a tavern owner in Nassau, waiting for her pirate partner to return. She would have to be ready to deal with the authorities, to hide the stolen goods, and to sell them to the right people. She would have to be a master of deception and a savvy businesswoman, a quiet hero in her own right. A quirky detail that adds to this narrative is that some of these women would have had their own pirate's code, a set of rules that governed their interactions with the pirates. They would have had to protect their own interests, and they would have had to make sure that they were not cheated by the very men they were helping. It was a dangerous game, and they played it just as well as anyone. For women like Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who were on the ships, the economics of piracy were a little different. Their share of the loot would have been their reward, a physical manifestation of their freedom and their courage. But for the women on land, the business of piracy was a daily struggle, a constant negotiation between profit and peril. Their stories are a testament to the fact that the pirate world was not just about the men who sailed the seas. It was also about the women who kept the whole enterprise afloat on land. Their quiet contributions are a crucial part of the story, and they deserve to be remembered just as much as the more famous female pirates. The secret lives of female pirates didn't just end on the high seas. They continued on land, and these lives were often just as complex and dangerous as their time on the ships. A mainstream historical fact is that when pirates weren't at sea, they were often in bustling port towns like Nassau or Port Royal. For women like Mary Read and Anne Bonny, who were in disguise, their lives on land would have been a constant performance. They would have had to maintain their male persona, and they would have had to be on guard at all times. They couldn't let their guard down, even for a moment, because a single mistake could lead to their discovery and their death. A fringe tidbit about this aspect of their lives is the psychological toll of this constant deception. Imagine living in a crowded, rowdy port town, surrounded by men, and you can't be yourself. You're always on edge, always looking over your shoulder. You have to pretend to be someone you're not, and you have to be good at it. This is a point where historians still argue about the mental health of these women. Were they able to maintain their sanity in such a high-stress environment? We'll probably never know for sure, but we can assume that it was a constant struggle. A quirky detail that adds to this narrative is that some female pirates, like Anne Bonny, would have had a network of friends and allies on land who knew their secret. These were the people they could trust, the people they could be themselves around. These quiet, hidden friendships would have been a lifeline for them, a small pocket of normalcy in a very chaotic world. For the women who didn't go to sea, their lives on land were a different kind of secret. They were the ones running the taverns and the brothels, the ones who were a crucial part of the pirate economy. They would have had to deal with the authorities, the merchants, and the pirates themselves. They were the ones who kept the whole system running, and they did it all in the shadows. Their lives were a constant negotiation between a public face of respectability and a private life of crime. They were masters of deception, and they had to be just as cunning and ruthless as the pirates on the ships. Their stories are a powerful reminder that the pirate world was not just about the men who sailed the seas. It was a complete ecosystem, and women were a crucial part of it. They were the ones who provided a safe haven for the pirates, the ones who managed the finances, and the ones who kept the whole enterprise afloat. Their quiet contributions are a crucial part of the story, and they deserve to be remembered just as much as the more famous female pirates. And so, as we leave the bustling port towns, we can think of these women living their secret lives, a quiet rebellion against a world that had tried to put them in a box. Their stories are a testament to their strength, their intelligence, and their will to survive. While female pirates, like Mary Read and Anne Bonny, were busy subverting gender roles on the high seas, it's worth considering what life was like for women on a mainstream naval vessel, such as a Dutch man-of-war. This is a mainstream historical fact that provides a stark contrast to the pirate's life. On a Navy ship, women were not a part of the crew. They were often either wives of officers or women who were part of the logistical staff on shore. Their presence on the ship was rare, and when they were there, it was in a highly regulated and supervised capacity. They were seen as a necessary evil, and their presence was often a source of friction and jealousy among the male crew. This is a point where historians still argue about the true nature of their roles. The answer is probably somewhere in the middle. But what is clear is that their lives were nothing like the lives of Mary Read and Anne Bonny. They were not equals, they were dependents, and their lives were dictated by the rules and regulations of the Navy. A quirky detail that adds to this narrative is that many naval crews believed that having women on board was bad luck, and it was another reason why women were so often excluded from life at sea. For Mary and Anne, their presence on a pirate ship was a form of rebellion against this very idea. They were living proof that women could be just as brave, just as skilled, and just as lucky as any man. They weren't just rebelling against their families or their society. They were rebelling against a system that had no place for them, a system that saw them as a source of bad luck and a distraction. Their choice to become pirates was a choice to be free, to be an equal, and to be a part of a world that was, for all its brutality, more open-minded than the world they had left behind. They were a force of nature, a quiet storm in a world that was defined by men. Life aboard a pirate ship wasn't all adventure and gold. A great deal of it was a monotonous struggle against boredom, sickness, and, most pressingly, hunger. As a mainstream historical fact, the diet of a pirate was notoriously terrible and a constant source of health problems. The primary staples were hardtack, a type of dry biscuit that was so hard it could break your teeth, and salted meat, which was often of questionable quality and infested with weevils. These foods, while they could last for a long time without spoiling, were lacking in essential nutrients, particularly vitamin C. This nutritional deficiency leads us to a fringe tidbit: scurvy. The symptoms were horrific: bleeding gums, loose teeth, open sores, and a general feeling of malaise. It was a slow and painful death, and it was a constant threat to every sailor, pirate or otherwise. This is a point where historians still argue about the true extent of the problem. Some believe that pirates were more susceptible to scurvy because they didn't have the same access to fresh food as naval ships, which would often have a doctor on board who knew how to treat it. A quirky detail that adds a bit of dark humor to this narrative is that pirates would sometimes try to cure scurvy with bizarre and ineffective remedies, such as drinking seawater or rubbing their gums with a mix of salt and vinegar. They would have eaten the same hardtack and the same salted meat, and they would have been just as susceptible to scurvy and other diseases. Their lives were a constant battle against the elements, against rival ships, and against their own bodies. Water would often go stale and grow a green film, so pirates would drink a lot of rum and beer, which would have a longer shelf life. This, of course, led to a lot of drunkenness and fighting, and it only added to the danger of life on the ship. And in that, there is a kind of dark poetry, a quiet reminder that the pirates' life was a brutal one, and their courage was not just in battle, but in their ability to endure the daily hardships of life at sea. The popular image of pirates, the one with the treasure maps marked with an X, a mainstream historical fact, is that the vast majority of these details are myths. While pirates did steal, and they did have treasure, it was almost never in the form of a buried chest. Their treasure was usually much more mundane: bolts of silk, barrels of rum, and other trade goods that were easy to sell. A fringe tidbit is that the idea of a treasure map is a complete fabrication, which was a very dangerous thing for a pirate to do. They would have also had to remember where they buried it, and given their lifestyle, that was a tall order. A quirky detail that adds to this is that the pirates' most valuable treasure was often not gold, but information. They would capture ships and interrogate the crew, asking them about the movements of other ships, the value of their cargo, and the location of the best ports to sell their loot. Some believe it was a clever bit of propaganda by the English government to make pirates seem more romantic and less like a serious threat to trade. Others believe it was simply a literary device that was so good that it became a part of the historical record. Whatever the reason, the treasure map is a powerful myth, and it's a quiet reminder that our understanding of history is often shaped by the stories we tell. For Mary Read and Anne Bonny, their treasure was not a chest of gold, but their freedom. Their treasure was the ability to live a life that was entirely their own, and in that, they were richer than any king or queen. They were not looking for a map to a hidden island. They were looking for a way to survive, and in that, they found a kind of treasure that was far more valuable than any gold. And so, we're left with this image of a pirate, not with a treasure map, but with a quiet sense of purpose, a quiet determination to live a life that was entirely their own. As a mainstream historical fact, the rise of more organized and powerful navies, particularly the British Royal Navy, was a major reason for the decline of Caribbean piracy. The major European powers, tired of the constant disruption to their trade routes, began to invest heavily in naval forces and they started to actively hunt down pirate ships. The pirates, with their smaller, less armed ships, were no match for these powerful naval fleets. A fringe tidbit about the end of the Golden Age is the use of amnesties. Governments, particularly the British, would offer pardons to pirates who turned themselves in and gave up their lives of crime. This was a clever strategy, as it not only reduced the number of pirates, but also created a rift in the pirate community. Some pirates, tired of the constant danger and the lack of a stable life, would accept the amnesty, while others would continue to fight. This created a sense of distrust and paranoia among the pirates, and it made it much harder for them to form a cohesive force. Regardless, they were highly effective, and they played a significant role in the downfall of piracy. A quirky detail that adds to this narrative is that many of the former pirates who accepted the amnesty would go on to become pirate hunters themselves. They would use their knowledge of the pirate world to help the authorities, and in doing so, they would be pardoned for their past crimes. It's a dark and ironic twist, and loyalty was often a luxury that no one could afford. For Mary Read and Anne Bonny, the end of the Golden Age was not a theoretical concept. It was a very real and present danger. They were living in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile to their way of life, and their capture was a sad and inevitable result of this larger historical trend. Their stories are a testament to their courage and their resilience, but they are also a quiet reminder that all stories, no matter how wild, must eventually come to an end. A mainstream historical fact is that the stories of women like Mary Read and Anne Bonny, they have been immortalized in books, movies, and video games, and they have become symbols of rebellion and female empowerment. They are a quiet reminder that courage knows no gender, and that a person's worth is not determined by their sex. The constant fears, often replaced by a romanticized version of swashbuckling adventure. This is a point where historians still argue about the ethics of this kind of storytelling. Is it a good thing that their stories are being told, even if they are being changed? Or is it a disservice to their memory to turn them into two-dimensional heroes? It's a complex question, and there is no easy answer. And they continue to be a source of inspiration for anyone who feels trapped by the limitations of their time. A quirky detail that adds to their legacy is the way they have become a kind of feminist icon. They were women who refused to be told what to do, and they created a life for themselves in a world that was not designed for them. They proved that a woman could be just as brave, just as skilled, and just as dangerous as any man, and in that there is a kind of quiet victory. As we come to the end of our journey, we can reflect on the final voyage of these remarkable women. We've traced their lives from their quiet, humble beginnings to their brief but spectacular careers as pirates. We've seen them defy every expectation, challenge every norm, and prove that a woman's courage and skill were just as valuable as a man's. A mainstream historical fact is that their stories, though brief, have had an outsized impact on our understanding of history and gender. They were a quiet revolution in a world that was not ready for them, and their legacy is a testament to their enduring spirit. A fringe tidbit about the pirates' final voyage is that it was often a quiet affair. After a life of chaos and violence, many pirates would seek a quiet end, a chance to live a peaceful life on land. This is a point where historians still argue about the number of pirates who successfully retired. Was it a common occurrence, or was it a rare event? We'll probably never know for sure, but we can assume that for many, The thought of a quiet life was a powerful motivator. For Mary, Read, and Anne Bonny, their final voyage was not a choice. It was an end that was forced upon them by the system they had spent their lives defying. But even in their defeat, there was a kind of victory. They had lived a life that was entirely their own, and in that, they had achieved a kind of freedom that was denied to most women of their time. They would think about their lives, their choices, and their regrets. It was a time to come to terms with their past and to prepare for their future, whatever that future may have been. For Mary and Anne, their final voyage was not just a physical journey to a prison cell. It was a psychological journey, a time to reflect on the lives they had led and the legacy they had created. And in that, there is a kind of quiet beauty, a silent peace that can only be found at the end of a long and difficult journey. Now, as the ship of our story quietly docks and the anchor settles into the sand, we can let the final images of their lives fade. The sound of the creaking ship, the distant cries of the gulls, the soft lapping of the waves against the shore. Let's let it all drift away, like a ship disappearing over the horizon. The rough edges of their story, the noise and the violence, can soften now. The cold reality of the prison, the sting of the salt spray, the roar of the cannons, ... all of it can become a gentle, distant hum. You've been a brave passenger on this long voyage, and now it's time to find your own quiet harbor. You're safe on shore, far from the storms and the chaos of the open sea. Let the quiet darkness of the night take over, and let the gentle hum of the world guide you into a peaceful, dream-filled sleep. The stories of these women, their quiet courage, and their fierce defiance will be waiting for you in the gentle waves of the morning. So, close your eyes, take a slow, deep breath, and let go. Sweet dreams.